Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this important update on COVID-19 and the impacts on the rural sector. On behalf of the CLA, I'm delighted to welcome you to what I'm sure will be an informative event. My name is Anne Maidment. I'm Director for the Southwest region, and I will be your chair for today's proceedings. Before we begin, a brief update from us here at the CLA. The COVID webpage is highly comprehensive, covering the breadth of government support and information our members need for all aspects of their businesses. There is now a library of member-only briefings covering a wide range of topics. We continue to keep them updated as government advice changes. We would also encourage members to contact their regional office should they need any advice or support. And of course, all of our previous webinars have been recorded and are available to watch again. We also welcomed recently the CLA's first ever podcast series, Rural Business Uncovered. Please do take a look. Again, links to this are via the CLA website. You can also find our Brexit Hub, providing rural businesses with advice on the steps that are needed to be taken and signposting for further information regarding Brexit. Since the publication of the Agricultural Transition Plan back in November, work has continued in earnest to ensure that our members are supported and made aware of the changes ahead. Our land use policy team are closely engaged on this with DEFRA. If you are reviewing your farm business, looking for new opportunities on your land, either with ELMS, natural capital, or perhaps diversification, again, please do contact your regional office. As the country endures its third coronavirus lockdown, there is much need to understand the impacts and effects on rural business and communities. From sectors such as food and farming that have seen major disruption in supply chains to others, most notably tourism and hospitality, where many businesses are struggling to survive. COVID-19 has decimated the foundations of the rural economy. We take the opportunity to reflect on the fast-changing scene of the COVID pandemic and the impact it has had on rural businesses and what it will mean moving forward. We are fortunate today to be joined by our resident expert, who needs very little introduction, I'm sure, to our audience today. Charles has had an incredibly busy time, not only overseeing the economic impacts of COVID, but also, of course, Brexit and rural economic development as a whole. Please do feel free to ask questions at any time using the Q&A button, and I will try to ask Charles as many as I can within our allotted time. Please do restrict your questions to the subject matter of the session today. Otherwise, do approach the CLA for advice in a normal manner. I should remind you that today's session is being recorded for future use, including availability to other members, and it will also be available on our website after the event. The format for today will be in a discussion form. Charles and I will be talking through the following areas, and I will be asking Charles questions as we go. If you have any questions on the following subjects, please do use the Q&A button or use the comments in the chat, and I will monitor these as we go through. So let us begin. Charles, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Anne.
So to start with, I think we probably ought to have a recap. So over the last 10, 11 months, all of us have experienced fundamental changes in the way we live and the way we work due to the impact and effect of COVID-19. Given these changes, I think it would be helpful for everyone here if you could just give a general overview, in a sense, a brief history of where we started off and where we are now.
Thanks, Anne, and good afternoon, everyone. Obviously, there are going to be differences to where we were in March last year and where we are now. So what we're going to look through is a comparative analysis, you could say, a kind of recap of the situation over the last 10, 11 months. if we look at lockdown 1, the government essentially is reacting to the crisis. You know, the support measures which the government introduced were rolled out very, very quickly. But of course, with that, there were a number of structural problems. If we look at one particular support scheme, the coronavirus job retention scheme, it was clear that worked very, very well. But in our view, there's a kind of failure between politics and science. The political points which were made by the politicians, you could say, were too optimistic and actually failing to understand the gravity of the situation. Remember, we're in lockdown from March the 23rd, essentially until July the 3rd. So that three and a half month period, the rate of infection is coming down all the time. The actual pressure on the NHS was getting less, and people thought, yeah, it's a one-off. You know, this can't continue. I think I can understand why the politicians were optimistic, and I think there is during that first lockdown, there were quite a few positives. And I think one of the greatest positives was this whole idea of a government roadmap, because it gave businesses a sense of certainty. Although obviously now, given the fact we're in lockdown 3.0, you could say that the government actually failed to fully understand the importance and the gravity of the pandemic. That's the positive. Let's look at the negative. I think it's quite obvious that since the end of the first lockdown, the government actually did take its eye off the ball. It thought infection rates are down, the summer's here, and the summer's come to save the country. And of course, we know now that the government actually reopened too quickly in a lot of sectors, but it was more casual reopening and it was too relaxed. The government failed to, as we know, the scientific advice. I think obviously what's clear here is that hindsight is a wonderful thing. But if we take the example of the government scheme, It's Good to Eat Out, during August, we now know that that actually had a particularly negative impact in terms of substantial increase in infection rates. And it was clear at that stage that the policy wasn't actually as strong as it needed to be. So as infection rates began to increase in August and September, the government had no real option but to take steps which were more restrictive than possibly were actually necessary. And again, you've got the political dynamic here of government backbenchers saying to its own government, hang on a minute, you're putting in restrictions which we haven't agreed to. Now, the difference here, though, is that the government had to be far more cautious, and it was clear that they were being directed by the scientific evidence and scientific data. And in a sense, what you could say is it was beginning to learn the mistakes made after the first lockdown. Now, if we go to the situation now, it's clear that the government is being deliberately cautious because it doesn't want to repeat those errors of the past, and it is making progress. However, because of the cautious approach which is being taken, it's going to be a slow process to actually come out of the third lockdown. But if this is going to work, it will require the consent, both economically and socially, of the public, but of course of business as well. And it needs to make very, very clear why progress is likely to be slower than was previously the case, certainly under the first lockdown. But just to end this first question and this answer, I think it's important to realize it's not just us. It's not just the UK. Every other country in the European Union, probably every country in the world, this is a global pandemic after all, has made the same mistakes. Now, it can't just be, Britain's gone out of its way and said, okay, we're going to do it completely differently to everybody else. It isn't. It's actually, in a sense, copied what's happened across the world. That may be, again, with hindsight, it may very well have been an error. But I think it's important to realize that it's not just us. It is every other country has made clear errors of judgment. You could say it's a failure of leadership, but I think it's important to realise that we have to be seen to be all in this together. And obviously we've had 11 months of this.
Mm. And we are now in the third lockdown, lockdown 3.0, in England, with the ongoing lockdown in Wales. I wonder if you could give us a sense of the differences between that first lockdown and this one we are in at the moment, because there seems to be some fundamental difference, such as the tier structure. And how long do you think these lockdowns will continue for?
Well, of course, as I said right at the start, we had the first lockdown on March the 23rd. We're in our third lockdown now. And as I go through, you'll see there have been substantial differences. And in a sense, the time periods are going to be different. So if we look at lockdown 1, it gave the impression that the measures imposed seemed at the time draconian. It was stay at home, only exercise once a day, for example, and most businesses, apart from those which were deemed to be key businesses or essential businesses, most businesses were closed. And of course, you have this, the public reaction and the public perception to the first lockdown, in the sense that it took on board the rules, it met the rules, and the most obvious case was, of course, social distances. But that acceptance by the public has changed. There's now greater pushback, and this has been recognised by government. And again, it comes back to the point I made at the beginning. The government is more cautious because it's actually begun to realise that the general public is now in the third lockdown, is generally taking the view, well, hold on a minute, we've done this before, we're having to do it again. Why are we having to do it again? Where's the messaging? There doesn't need to be consistent messaging here. But again, there's a change in government attitude, because it's now relying purely on scientific evidence. We've got the vaccine program going through. That will have a major impact as to how we move forward. It will also have a major impact on the public's behaviour. And what we've seen over the last 11 months is that government has adjusted its policy according to the circumstances. We had the situation, of course, in September with the introduction of the rule of 6. We have the Prime Minister's announcement before Christmas that Christmas would be open for Christmas for 5 days. Of course, as we know, as the infection rates increased, we are only allowed one day off from the restrictions, and then we were back in. So again, it's a case that the government has reacted and changed policy according to the evidence that it has in front of it. And of course, the government was never going to know what the impact of the new variants were going to be. Of course, we have what's called the Kent variant, where its transmissibility rate was far higher than the original rate of the virus. We've got the South African variant now. So, as everybody now knows, because we're all scientists because of the pandemic, it's a case that viruses mutate. Coronavirus is no different to any other virus. But of course, this has come as a shock, not just to the British public, it's come as a shock to government. And it means that government decision making has had to act more quickly. And the government, you could have thought that the government was introducing policies overnight during the first lockdown. In fact, that wasn't the case. There was some considered thought. What's happening now is that the government is reintroducing the policies it had originally, but is adding to them, because it's managing to learn from the errors and the mistakes that were made before. And also the government needs to be, or as recognised, it needs to be more vigilant and more resilient. I think it's important to stress that the many thousand of public officials, whether in central government or local government, have been directly involved in the pandemic, and there's a pressure building there. You could say the government's been learning on the job, but the decisions that are being made now are far more effective. And you could say, as we've moved on, as we've got more experience of the pandemic, more experience of the virus, it's the case that we understand how it works. We understand the thought processes of the coronavirus itself. If we turn to the tier structure, which came in after we had to go back into a kind of semi-lockdown. In my view, I think it's highly unlikely that the tier structure will remain post the end of this lockdown. It's too confusing, and unfortunately it is too open to abuse, and irrespective of the success or otherwise of the vaccination program, what we don't want to see is infection rates, the R rate, going up again, because that will just mean we're having an open and shut economy, which is the last thing that we want to do.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I sorry.
No, you carry on.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking of you talk about government decisions that have been made, and and when we'll come out of this lockdown and what the tiers will be. But I'm sure those listening will be really interested to know, when will the rural sector open again? When can the pubs open? The gardens are open now, but what do you think in terms of timescale for businesses that rely on areas such as leisure and tourism?
Well, I think there are indicators to suggest that you could actually put together a provisional timetable. I'm going to be like the government here. I'm going to take a very cautious approach. So if you look at the statements which have come from politicians, they're saying that schools will partially reopen, they think, on the 8th of March after the spring half term. That will mean that schools are likely to come back as a whole, probably before the end of the spring term. So we're looking at the last week of March. I would also say if the roadmap that the government's going to introduce on the 22nd of February is consistent with what it did before, and it's highly likely it will be, it'll indicate that there will be stages. So the schools will reopen. Non-essential businesses, non-essential retail businesses, for example, you're on your high street, are likely to reopen probably middle of March. I think the expectation, however, for a tourism business or those in the hospitality sector to think they're going to reopen at Easter is probably off the mark. I think it's going to be a case that they're more likely to be able to reopen probably middle to late April, and it could very well be May. We're being cautious in that approach, primarily because we have to wait and see have to look at the effectiveness of the vaccination program, and that is a key element as to how we're going to move forward in this. So, timetable, we can put forward a provisional timetable, but we need to be cautious. But if you're in tourism or hospitality sectors, from our analysis, you're looking at middle to late April at best.
Okay, so moving on from this and the timescales, and we're looking at the government decisions around coronavirus and a number of different support schemes, suggesting the different approaches that have been taken. What have these support measures been, and how long are they likely to continue? Okay,
so let's start from the very beginning, back in March, 23rd of March last year. So we started off with the coronavirus job retention scheme, created, as I said at the start, and it introduced the concept of furloughing. Furloughing is an American term, but it's now embedded within British culture. According to the latest data that we've seen, 3.8 million people being furloughed at the end of December, with a peak at about 9 million people in April and May 2020. For businesses employing less than 50 people, a total of 550,000 were furloughed at the end of 2020. That's a sizable number. Now, the job retention scheme actually ends on the 30th of April. And as we go through our little chat, we'll look at the measures that the CLA wants the government to act upon and to put in place. And one of those is the extension of the job retention scheme and other support schemes that we'll go on to. And the key element also of the initial support schemes was the self-employed grant scheme. Now, we're now at the stage that the third grant is being paid. Fourth grant is likely to be available at the start of March. But again, that comes to an end on the 30th of April. Again, it needs to be extended. We had the business rates holiday, schemes will run until the end of the financial year, so at the end of March. We have two main loan schemes here. We've got the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme, which has been successful, and it's up to, you can apply for up to a £5 million loan, and so far at the end of January there are 87,500 approvals. That ends on the 31st of March this year. Let's compare that, however, to the bounce back loan scheme, which was introduced a little later than Sybil's. That's, you can apply for a loan of up to £50,000, but whereas Sybil's the number of approvals at 87,500, with a bounce back loan, it's 1.5 million. Now that proves one thing, and one thing, again, in my view, this is a major CLA win, because we were pressing the government to ensure that there were loan schemes which were viable for small businesses. Small businesses didn't need, or rather the vast majority of small businesses weren't looking for loans of up to £5 million. They were looking for loans in terms of aiding cash flow, and that's why you've got a £50,000 limit. Again, that ends on the 31st of March 2021. So if you take these two schemes together, so far nearly £21 billion has been lent under the Sybil scheme. Nearly 45 billion has been lent under the bounce back scheme. They're the two loan schemes. You've got other support measures such as statutory sick pay, the VAT deferral scheme. There's a new scheme, online scheme, was announced late last night, and again details are on the CLA Covid19 webpage. And you've got the self-assessment tax extensions, which are now being extended to the end of February. I think it's important that these schemes are seen for what they are. They're there to support businesses. They're there to underpin the economy, and they have proved to work. I can remember that I think it was the Public Accounts Committee or the National Audit Office actually said that the level of fraud in these schemes is running at around 7 to 10%, which is quite high. I think you've also got to bear in mind that these schemes came in very, very quickly. And as I said in answer to your first question, there were structural problems, and we're beginning to see those structural problems. However, that shouldn't detract us from the need to have these schemes extended, particularly given the fact that the lockdown is going to be, the effects of the lockdown are still going to be there. So we need these schemes in place for a time period after we end lockdown. So it needs to be, when these schemes are removed, it's a gradual adjustment so that businesses are aware of what's happening and can then take into account that gradual removal in terms of their business planning. And again, this is vitally important to business cash flow, because what we don't want to see is a cliff edge scenario where support is turned off overnight.
Okay. I think we were going to do a poll to see what members, there we go. So first poll, yeah. So just wanted to, out of interest, hear from members the main barriers for reopening. I mean, Charles, do you want to talk through your thoughts on these?
Yeah, I think it's important for us to gauge what the membership is thinking. We've been doing that certainly since the beginning of the pandemic, but it's important now for us to understand what those barriers are so that we can inform government with evidence, so that they can actually be ready for when the economy can reopen, because this is going to be crucially important to the viability of businesses in the future. So it's important that we get as much information as we possibly can. And I believe there will be a second poll also during the webinar, which we'd obviously like people to take part in.
Yeah, absolutely. And whilst actually the members are looking at that poll, I just want to talk about, I think one of the key highlights that you've touched upon is the change in government policy, certainly from the first lockdown to the current one. And what do you think this is based on? The available scientific data, the need to keep the government together, or the need to make sure the public is on side, perhaps?
Well, I think it's important to recognise that the government's been criticised from all sides. You could say from the media, from stakeholders, businesses, and the general public. And it, as I said before, even its own backbenchers. And in some areas, there is a clear justification that the government hasn't done enough or has acted too late. If you look at what's happening now and the government's quarantine policy in terms of people coming into the UK, it could be the case that there is a strong argument to say that the borders should have been closed right at the start of the beginning of lockdown, or the first lockdown. And I think that's quite a powerful argument. It hasn't responded quickly enough to the scientific evidence, or it's been making statements which are geared to politicians. They're geared to, in a sense, they're short, sharp sound bites. They're there for public consumption, and that's all. They don't really do a lot. And I think the government's been lacking decisions based on evidence simply to make a point. But as I said, there has been this change in government policy and government thinking since September and October last year. The one thing that we've always said to government from the beginning is that there has to be clear, there has to be consistent messaging. That was the case at the first lockdown. The government seemed to lose its way. The messaging got confused. And messaging is now back to being far stronger. Now, when you look at the Downing Street press conference, you have the three bits on the lectern when you've got Matt Hancock or whoever is actually presenting the Downing Street press conference. Again, the messaging is consistent. It's clear. So we managed to get around that. And I think we just can't criticise the government on this. I think the media has a lot of questions to answer, whether it be the Times, the Sun, the Daily Mail, or the Guardian. In looking at this, and in the months I've been dealing with COVID-19, it's interesting looking at media reaction, both in print, online, and also social media as well. And I think what the media has tended to overreact significantly on a number of issues, and it's led to a situation where you have a lot of misinformation out there. A lot of people are actually accepting what is being said on social media because they believe it to be true, or it's been spun in such a way that they believe it. We've seen this not just in this country, but the United States is a very good example of this. As the scientists, though, if you look at Chris Whitty, you look at Patrick Vallance, you look at Jonathan Van Tam, amongst others, the one thing that they've tried to not only reassure the general public, but focus and emphasize is that decisions which are being made now have to be made on the science. We have to see infection rates go down. And as I said before, we have to take a cautious approach. We need to learn the lessons of what we learned from the first lockdown. We need to not make the same mistakes that we did before.
Perfect. So these are the results from the poll, and this leads us on to the next question, where I want to start looking at the future. So talking about the roadmap and how we move on. So this is interesting, actually, that the main barriers from those listening in, it's cash flow, and then actually understanding how to meet with COVID secure guidelines, which is absolutely right. And it's quite a myriad of risk assessments and things to think about when you're opening to the public as well. So if we move on to the next question, you mentioned that government need to produce a roadmap towards recovery, and we haven't seen one yet. I think it's probably due quite soon. But what do you think needs to be in that roadmap for us?
Well, as you said, we know that the roadmap is coming. We believe that the Prime Minister will make a national statement on the television on the 22nd of February. We believe it will be similar to the roadmap which was announced in May last year. So it will be very high level, it will be very general, but it will give us the indicators that we need in terms of reopening the economy. But as I said before, we can see a provisional timetable where the schools are reopened over a period of time, where non-essential shops are opened, and when tourism and hospitality businesses can get back to doing what they do best, and that's running their businesses and creating, giving back to society. But so that's what the roadmap needs to do. It needs to give certainty to business. It needs to give certainty to society. It also needs to give a clear indication as to what's going to happen with the support measures. And we think that's likely to happen, not with the roadmap, but with the budget on the 3rd of March. But in terms of what we think the government needs to do, again, it's to do with the extension of the current support measures. So if you look at the business rates holiday, for example, that needs to be extended by 12 months. The temporary decision to reduce VAT on tourism products or tourism accommodation and attractions from 20% to 5% needs to be made permanent, because we've already calculated that over a 10-year time period, the Treasury actually wins. Now, if you look at the amount of money that the government would have spent up to March this year, up to March 2021, it's in the region of £500 billion. If the government was to make the 5% VAT rate permanent for tourism accommodation and attractions, we believe that in the first 2 years, the government would only lose 280 million. By the end of the 10-year period, however, it would gain by £4.5 billion. So again, it's a positive for the government. Now, as I said before, the job retention scheme needs to be extended until we get to a point where businesses, you could say, it comes back to the poll that we've just seen, where cash flow is certain. So it needs to be a gradual removal, not a cliff edge. Again, it's the same principle applies to the loan schemes. They need to be extended until cash flow is firmed up. One of the interesting and important points that's come out of COVID-19 has been you could say, the performance and attitude of the insurance companies. And we'll discuss this probably later. We have a situation where businesses have taken out business interruption insurance, made a claim, that claim has been rejected. Now, what we've seen over the past 10 months is a situation where there is very little flexibility in the attitude of insurers. We've now got to the situation where the Supreme Court has had to step in and basically say to the insurers, sorry, you can't do that. You're effectively stopping a business surviving. The business was a reasonable policy holder. You have to abide by the claim that they're making. And we know that 370,000 businesses are likely to be able to make a successful claim. But what the government needs to do in the future is actually look at this again, look at the whole concept of insurance in terms of crisis, and in terms of the crisis we have now with the pandemic. But we had this with, people will remember foot and mouth disease back in 2001, 2002. There was a problem again with insurance. It's the case that the government needs to introduce a reinsurance scheme. It needs to essentially underpin, in times of crisis, the insurance market so that businesses have certainty. As I said, absolutely essential for the government roadmap when it comes out to provide that certainty so that businesses can plan. We also want to look in the short to medium term. We want to see, we know we will be able to recover. We're not going to be able to recover immediately. It will take time. So therefore, let's introduce some flexibility. Let's look at the planning system, for example. Let's have some major reforms of the planning system whereby permitted development rights, for example, are extended. Council tax exemptions are longer. You know, they're not 6 months, they're extended. Over the next 2 years, we're going to have what's called the UK Share Prosperity Fund, which will provide grants for rural businesses. What we need is, again, we need the detail, but we do need the government to act on that. The very fact that we're talking like this on a virtual platform underlines the importance of digital technology. However, what we found is that although people may be able to get broadband and up-to-date digital technology, they don't know how to use it. So what we're saying is the government needs to introduce a national digital skills program. But again, as I said before, we need to be cautious. We need to recognize that what COVID-19 has shown all of us is that things change, and things change very, very quickly. Those points that I've made, those asks we put into our budget submission to government, obviously before the 3rd of March when the budget takes place. However, those are the key policy aspects that we believe that the government needs to take on board so that we can move forward, we can reset, and we are going to be able to recover.
Yeah, and we do have another poll on this, which we're going to put up now. And whilst that is up, I just want to ask you a question that's come through from one of our members. David Hughes has asked, and I know this is an area you'll be quite familiar with, wondering what your thoughts are on LEP administration across the country on COVID grants, some very bureaucratic, some quick in and out, and that the funds restricted to ERDF guidelines, which has been a barrier to ag businesses who have, say, diversified to tourism, but can't get the grant due to SIC codes. Can the government embrace all?
Well, the short answer to that is no, the government can't embrace all. And I think what we found with the Rural Development Programme, for example, and also the structural funds, the EU structural funds, this comes back to what I was saying about the Share Prosperity Fund, is that we need to have a really serious rethink about how we do this. We do believe in the principle that in order to make delivery more consistent, it has to be at a local level. That is likely to mean that local enterprise partnerships in England will have to play a greater role. I think it's important to stress here, and in a sense to support the LEPs, their role in terms of structural funds was very limited, and it was advisory. The decisions were made at a national level. It was clear over the last 4 or 5 years that decisions making at a national level on structural grant funding do not work. Those decisions have not worked. I think in our own area of the rural economy, if we look at the growth programme, we know that the Rural Payments Agency has been hideously slow in getting the grants out, in making the decisions. All that does is slow down businesses who want to be able to diversify, who want to be able to exploit the opportunities that are there. I think the rules relating to the European Regional Development Fund, the ERDF, a lot of blame could be attached to the European Commission for putting those rules in place to begin with. That's partly true, and the European Commission is a very bureaucratic body. However, I think it's important also to realise that the UK government has had a history of gold-plating European regulations. Now, we're out of the EU now. In certain areas, we don't have to abide by European regulations anymore. We can set our own. We can set our own national guidelines. We can set our own national regulations. We're not confined. This, through the UK Share Prosperity Fund, is an excellent opportunity of doing just that. The governance structure has to be right. And what we've already said to government, both at a central government level and a local government level, is that there has to be a clear line of communication between their decision-making processes and the businesses on the ground. what we can't afford to see is a vacuum, a policy vacuum between the decisions that are made, and then when those decisions are made, they affect the businesses who are meant to benefit from them. Because we've seen too often in the past decisions which are wrong, and we've made this clear to government. And what it's done is it just makes it far more difficult for businesses to operate as they need to.
And yeah, we've had a comment from Dave Cooling saying they've been unable to access much of the support due to their business structure and being a relatively young business. Is this something you've seen quite a lot of in the last year from CLA members as a major issue?
It is. It became a major issue within 2 months of the pandemic. We saw evidence, which again we related straight back to government, that government or public policy wasn't helping business. Now, it could be the case that some business structures are not actually suited to the kind of businesses they're trying to run. One of the concerns that we've had for many years has been the fact that many businesses don't have business plans. Now, I can remember being in a meeting with Lord Sugar, where he said that 80 to 90% of businesses that he knew of, and he knows quite a few, do not have business plans. Now that's changing because, of course, the need for capital from financial lenders, and that's a good thing. Business plans are absolutely crucial, but it's a case that the government has to work with the industry, has to work with the business, and it's only now, 11 months into the pandemic, when we're actually seeing the government realizing that. And I was doing a podcast this morning on the wedding sector and the lack of support for weddings from the government. It's only now that the government is beginning to understand how business actually operates. Instead of the civil servants talking about administration, it needs to understand the realities of the business environment. And it's only now beginning to grasp that. I would say, well, certainly in terms of the pandemic, at least 11 months too late. They finally got onto the right page that every business is currently on.
So we've had the results come up, and actually, aside from 2 of them, it's pretty level pegging actually. So there's quite a lot of priorities there. Obviously, the 5% on tourism is something we've been pushing for some time now. Yes, the cash flow, again, very important with CBILS. So you mentioned the wedding sector. Which sectors do you believe are most at risk from the economic fallout that we are seeing? As I say, you mentioned the wedding sector was severely impacted by COVID-19. What, in your view, needs to be done?
Well, I think there are three sectors that you can pinpoint. One is the wedding sector, which I'll talk about in a minute. The others are obviously tourism and hospitality. And what slightly unnerved me was the fact that I looked at the latest forecast from Visit Britain as to the losses for the tourism and hospitality sector for rural businesses for 2020. When we looked at the figures back in, I think it was November last year, it was something, the losses were running around £25 billion, a lot of money. And you can understand why. The current figure for 2020 is £50 billion will be lost in terms of lost spend for last year. That is huge. And that means that it's going to take longer for businesses to be able to recover. If you look at the wedding sector in particular, it's a sector which generates nearly £15 billion revenue to the exchequer, or to the economy rather, in 2019. We have nearly 280,000 weddings a year. There are 400,000 jobs on the line, but there is no targeted support for the wedding sector. It's as if the government hasn't understood how weddings actually work. The very fact that weddings have a very fragmented supply chain. So you could be looking at your florist. invitation, invitation maker, your wedding venue. And of course, we realize that there are a number of CLA members who have substantial wedding venue businesses. Your wedding car business, for example, it's a very fragmented supply chain. These are small businesses. Some of them are micro businesses. Without any support, any targeted support, they will go under. They will cease trading. And we've already seen over 2020 in the wedding sector losses running over £6 billion so far, and those losses are continuing to mount.
Huge amount.
And what's going to be needed is a clear program, a clear detailed roadmap. But that roadmap has to be done in conjunction with both government and the business and the industry, because we know that the government doesn't understand the industry. The industry understands the industry. The businesses know how the wedding sector works, and we need to get that message firmly across the government, because if we don't, then a thriving industry such as the wedding sector will not be thriving for much longer. Yeah.
So I want to ask about the longer term and what do you think the impact will be on the rural economy? Are the economic consequences going to be felt for years to come? How do you feel about that?
I think it's going to be the case that we were originally looking at recovery, certainly from an economics point of view, of 5 years. Or 5 years to get back to pre-COVID levels. It would take that long. But that was before the third lockdown came in at the beginning of January. We now think that period has been extended probably to about 8 years. So you're looking to possibly the end of this decade for the economy to be able to recover to pre-COVID levels. And as we've seen with the polls, it's all about cash flow. It's all about the structures of business support. Now, I think it's the case that we're getting to a situation, it's not just about, certainly in terms of the rural economy, it's not just about COVID. There are two other major policy issues which we are dealing with, which we need to understand and which actually come together in terms of economic impacts with COVID, and that's Brexit and the impacts of Brexit, and also, of course, the impacts of agricultural policy change. By 2024, we know that the government intention is to reduce the basic payment by half and convert that into public goods, natural capital. Hopefully that will work, but of course that will have a negative impact on some of our members. We know that Brexit is a challenge because it's challenging the very fundamentals of our trading system. And it's our trading system, how we import and export, which has a direct and indirect effect on the prices which are received by producers in the marketplace. What it will mean, however, is that it will lead to, certainly in terms of agriculture, a restructuring of the industry. And we've estimated and we've modelled that we think that over the next 5 years, we could see 20% of farmers going, or rather 20% of farmers currently producing, no longer producing. They may diversify, some may be bought up by larger farms or estates. And that would lead to economies of scale, which would, from an economics point of view, actually be a good thing. So it's going to be a case that a lot will depend on the kind of coalition of interests, all these three areas coming together and what the impact will be. But unfortunately, I'd have to say that we're not looking at a short-term fix here. And I think everybody realizes it's not going to be a short-term fix. We're not going to return to where we were pre-COVID in terms of normal or normality. We're looking at a new normal. We're looking at different working practices, different economics. And when we say different economics, we're also looking at different politics. So COVID will rather prove to be a huge dynamic within society as we move forward. And it should be seen, certainly, as we begin to recover, as an opportunity. So there will be opportunities for businesses both to recover, but also to actually become more resilient in the future.
Okay, that's really interesting. And you've painted a picture of where change is inevitable and where it will take some time before we get to any form of what we consider normal or the new normal. So what then is the CLA doing in order to help and assist the membership?
I think, let me go back to the podcast that I was doing this morning on weddings. The other guest who was contributing was a CLA member. She's got a wedding venues business, I believe, in Suffolk. And the first thing that she said, and her first concern, was the lack of information that she was getting from the government. She got more information from the CLA than she did from the government, which was, you know, a huge boon, you could say, because what we've been doing ever since we went into the first lockdown is providing the information to the membership through the webpage, through the Covid19 web hub. Now, we have over, I think it's 250 now, 250 different categories of information in there, which we keep regularly up to date. We've also, because of we recognise the impact that COVID will have on the tourism and hospitality sectors. We were one of the first organisations to produce secure guidelines that the government could use to be able to reopen businesses when the opportunity arose, and those guidelines are still valid now. And what we will be doing is tailoring those guidelines to what the situation will be post the third lockdown when we come out of that, but also looking at, as I said, the wedding sector as well, because the wedding sector was never able to reopen in the same way as tourism businesses were. They were constrained, and they've never experienced secure COVID-19 secure guidelines before. So what we're doing there is we're providing information, we're disseminating information, we're analysing the information that we're getting, because you could say information is power. We've actually managed to recognise that members require as much information as possible. What we don't obviously want to do is overload members with information, but the goal is to make sure that members can actually, through that information, make their businesses as resilient as possible by giving them the data that they need and the information that they need on the government support schemes. What's happening with the Supreme Court in terms of the business interruption case, for example. We did a piece on that last week, where the Financial Conduct Authority has now posted on its webpage or website information as to how to make a claim and a frequently asked questions section. So what we're trying to achieve is a balanced approach, and we've also worked with other stakeholders to lobby government for change. For extensions to support schemes. We lobby heavily with the CBI, with the NFU and with others in order for the government to recognise the importance of the rural economy to the overall economy, but also to make sure that members actually understand what is happening on the ground, how government is thinking, so we can get that kind of government thought process to members so that they can adjust their businesses as they need to. Obviously, we understand the pressures that businesses are under. It's highlighted by the importance of cash flow. We knew that, and this is why we pushed for the bounce back loan scheme, because we could see how important that was going to be to business, and the numbers prove its importance and its effectiveness. We will continue to provide the information. We will continue to publicise that, and we continue to lobby government. I think finally I'd say it's been a very long year, and I don't see it stopping anytime soon, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think I fear you might be right, Charles. Thank you for that. I'm going to just turn very quickly to some questions that have come in from the members. One from Claire Wright, I'd like to start with. Should rural businesses be considering some sort of tourism offer to take advantage of the proposed boom in domestic tourism, so the staycations that we've heard about. I'm hearing that many cottages sites are already fully booked, despite Mr. Schaap's warning today.
Well, Mr. Schaap's warning was primarily targeted towards overseas holidays, wasn't targeted towards domestic tourism, i.e. your staycation issue. I think it's the case that when you take into account if VAT is reduced to 5% for tourism accommodation and attractions, that will act as a boon as well. I think that what we were concerned about last year was whether there was pent-up demand for staycation holidays or domestic holidays. The evidence was clear during July to September that the demand was heavy, and we believe that demand will be probably heavier still during the spring and summer this year. So it's going to be a case that demand will outstrip supply. So it's very possible that prices will increase. So that hopefully, if there is an increase in price, will lead to a benefit to businesses in order to help them to recover and to actually get back the money that they lost because of the lockdowns.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've heard of things like the extension of temporary uses on land to 56 days from 28 for this year. So there's definitely opportunities out there to do things on your farm for the tourism sector this summer. Sebastian Anstruther has made a comment, which I'll just read out. LEPs seem unable to support landowners to convert redundant agricultural buildings for office or other commercial use. Only the businesses that will occupy them. This needs to change, as without the office and commercial space being created, we cannot support the economy in the rural area, which I think is something we would all agree with.
No, absolutely.
And then
I think it's the case that it's something that we are pushing. I think it comes back to the point I was making about planning. The planning system needs to be far more flexible. There needs to be a far greater understanding of the needs of rural businesses, because they underpin rural areas, rural communities, which is, that is absolutely essential. If we don't get this right, then there won't be much of a rural economy left. That's why now is becoming so important.
And I'm following on from that, Jeremy Phillipson has asked, would a new grant scheme be worth devising to support businesses to adjust business models, new skills, and innovate and adapt to the new normal? So accessible and available to rural micro firms, deployed via much needed replacement of the LEADER funding programme.
Well, I personally don't think that the LEADER funding programme should be stopped. I think the UK Shared Prosperity Fund is an opportunity where we can really develop community-led local development, which is a big thing in the EU, but we've never really certainly caught on within government. LEADER's proved to be successful. It's effective. Why stop something that works? To me, it doesn't make any sense. But what is important is that the relationships, we mentioned LEPs earlier, the relationships between LEPs and local businesses significantly improve. What we don't want to see are officials in local enterprise partnerships being deemed to be in ivory towers, because that's not going to do anybody any good. That may be the case in central government, in certain government departments. What we don't want to see is for that to be the case for economic, local economic development. What we are pushing, and I've been pushing this for a number of years, is to ensure that government departments fully understand, not just DEFRA, but other government departments fully understand the importance of rural economic development, because without that understanding, they will continue to make decisions which go against the interests of rural businesses.
Yeah. So I think that's probably all we've got time for in terms of questions coming in. There's a huge amount around this in terms of the recovery and opportunities out there as well for the members. I think certainly in terms of looking towards things like ELM or perhaps any changes in tax reform that might come in, certainly do contact us, because the CLA are there to help and support you and give you advice as to what's coming up next. So Charles, thank you very much for your insights today. I think it's, as I say, a huge area that we're covering at the moment. Please do look at the CLA website, or do contact us directly with any questions that may come to mind afterwards. And I'm sorry we couldn't get through all of your questions today, but we will follow them up after the webinar. Coming up next, another large area that we're working on that has been an issue raised due to lockdowns is public access. So this is a very popular webinar, and I think limited on spaces. So if you are interested, do sign up soon. And obviously, as I say, all of our previous webinars are available to download and watch from our website. So thank you to Charles, thank you to the audience for being so attentive, and we will hopefully see you very soon. Many thanks.